I grew up in Beaufort, in a 6-room farmhouse with a couple of leaning posts to keep it from falling. I came up in a time when men were men. They didn't wear no earrings. Joe Frazier. The story of boxing is rich and never-ending. Each year, fresh champions emerge on its pages. Some gain popularity, but only for a brief moment, which fades away as their sports career ends. However, there are boxers whose reputation is everlasting.
Muhammad Ali sees the punch coming, rolls with it, but the tremendous power fells him anyway.
Boxing Classics begins a series of documentaries about legends. Our first hero is a representative of the golden era of boxing. He is one of the 3 kings of the heavyweight division, a true man of his word, and a man of honor. His name is Smokin Joe Frazier. Joe was born in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1944, a region far from boxing and totally unpromising. His parents were sharecroppers, who worked hard to raise 9 children. Joe and his other siblings also experienced the hardships of working on cotton plantations. We might have never known who Joe Frazier was if his father hadn't bought a TV one day. The Frazier family and their neighbors gathered to watch boxing matches. While they watched, Joe tried to imitate the boxers. At that moment, someone said, "Look at him. He looks just like Joe Louis." This phrase changed Joe's worldview forever. At that moment, little Joe had a dream that seemed like a fairy tale. He wanted to be a champion of the world. He filled a sackcloth with cloth, corncobs, and bricks, and began practicing his punches. He didn't have gloves, so Joe used his father's tie and his mother's stocking as padding on his hands, punching the bag. Although his parents didn't forbid him from boxing, nobody thought it would lead to anything good. Nonetheless, the aspiring boxer was obsessed with the sport.
I was going to school, but I didn't go to school. I think I learned how to spell cat and dogs, that was all. And the guy who was sitting next to me, I had a copy of his paper. Most likely he was wrong, so therefore I was the same way. They were wrong again. So therefore, I never would grow to be, let's say, a lawyer, but growing to be, let's say, champion of the world.
At 15, he joined his brother in New York. A year later, he made Philadelphia his new home. The city became very dear to him. At 16, he married. Joe became a father of 2 children. To support his family, he held various jobs such as working at the Coca-Cola factory, being a loader, working as a security guard, working in a slaughterhouse, even stole cars that he'd scrap. Despite the hardships, Frazier always found time to train. He met his coach and manager, Yancey "Yank" Durham, in the Police Athletic League, and together they formed one of the most triumphant duos in boxing history. Every great champion has a unique boxing style. Frazier was no exception. His main weapon was his amazing left hook. In the opinion of many, it was the greatest hook in history. But not everyone knows what contributed to its creation. As a kid, Joe hurt his left hand running from a boar. His family couldn't afford medical attention, so his hand didn't heal properly. But what seemed like a problem turned into his signature move. As the boxer explained, this event affected how he threw punches. But there's more. When I was born, people came to the house and gathered round to see if I was missing an arm. See, my dad was missing his left hand and part of his left forearm, and those people didn't realize that my dad's missing arm didn't have nothing to do with genes. When I was a boy, I used to pull a big cross saw with my dad. He used his right hand, so I'd have to use my left. You could say that was the root of my left hooks. Early in his sporting career, Frazier tried to box in the classical style, but Yancey Durham told him it would not work.
He wanted to move. He quit nights. He'd seen other guys doing it, and he thought he was the type of fighter that could move around the ring. And I said, look, this is something we have to stop. This nonsense running around the ring and trying to box. You're not a boxer. You're too short for a boxer. You're a fighter. You got the power. And I figured by teaching him the born-in style, slipping and all the time, and keeping after a guy, that he would be successful in this, fighting his style there. If you look at the boy's structure, he's a strong boy, big thighs, and he's a very good puncher, and you got to keep the guy applying pressure on these fighters.
Joe Frazier used a boxing style called bob and weave. This technique involves defensive movements that look like a sewing machine. Frazier would slip away from punches and sneak up on his opponents to land the deadly hook. Once, Yancey Durham said to Joe, "Go ahead and hit him hard enough to make your gloves smoke." That's how Frazier got his nickname. His amateur career was booming. 3 years in a row he won Golden Gloves, smashing anyone and everyone. The only person to defeat Frazier was Buster Mathis. He defeated him twice, blocking his path to the Tokyo Olympics. Joe was so desperate that he talked about ending his career. However, the fighter was supported, and to keep his spirits up, offered to go to the games as a reserve. Witnesses claimed that Mathis was lazy at the training camp, but Frazier smoked like hell, and fate rewarded him. Buster was injured in a demonstration sparring session. That made the way for Frazier to represent the United States. Smokin Joe defeated boxers from Uganda, Australia, and the Soviet Union on his way to the finals. During the semifinals, he defeated one of the favorites, Vadim Emelianov, despite breaking the thumb on his left hand. Joe kept the injury a secret. He didn't want to miss his chance to win the gold medal. In the final, he defeated Hans Huber. Coming to Tokyo as a reserve, he was the sole American boxer who won the gold medal. Back at home, Joe Frazier was filled with hope and determination. However, his pro debut had to be postponed due to an injury, and employers were declining to hire him. The family's financial situation worsened, but there was a solution. The Cloverly Syndicate was created through the efforts of Yancey Durham. It is a community of local businessmen who invested in the boxer's career. Finally, Joe was able to fully focus on sports and turned pro in 1965. Sadly, he suffered a serious injury that same year. Working on a speed bag, a clamp broke and fragments hit the boxer's left eye. In spite of several surgeries, a cataract formed, and in the end, he was almost completely blind in that eye. For any other man, it would have been the end of his career, but not for Frazier. In his typical style, he decided to hide the fact. Many years later, he told how he did it. "Early in my career, I was friends with some doctors, so we kept the story a secret. I even had to learn the eye test chart by heart." But there was another way. Several times, Joe did a clever trick and fooled the doctors. He'd cover his eye with his left hand and then his right. A real trickster. Once again, life circumstances didn't stop Frazier, and his opponents had far smaller chances to do that. Just like in the amateurs, he scored knockout after knockout. But becoming a legend doesn't come from easy victories. It comes from fierce battles in which heroes fight like gladiators. In September of 1966, Joe Frazier faced such a rival. It was Argentine Oscar Bonavena. That day, Frazier never realized how hard a fight awaited him. Joe easily won the first round. It looked like everything was on plan, but the Argentine's spoiler style foreshadowed difficulties. Oscar is agile and not so much dangerous as uncomfortable. In the second round, Bonavena hits a straight right and Frazier goes down. This happened for the first time in his pro career.
For Olympic boxing Frazier down.
Before he can recover, he's again on the canvas.
Frazier down again.
The 3 knockdown rules were supposed to stop the fight after the third down. Joe has literally come to the edge of the abyss. In such a position, everyone adopts defensive tactics, but Frazier goes for a sharp escalation. This fighter's mentality had no such thing as retreat. Oscar knows he's missing his chance for a knockout and reverts to his pest tactics. He moves away, then sharply closes in and clinches. Really nasty style. But Joe also has tricks of his own. Watch out for the way he hits Bonavena's right hip to slow his footwork. The referee, of course, doesn't react. Back then, such nonsense wasn't paid attention to at all. In the fourth round, Frazier is in the lead. He lands a left hook so accurately that Oscar's head almost leaves the ring. One time, Joe said, "I'm ruthless in the ring. My goal is to destroy." Looking at the poor Argentine, you're sure of the truth of those words. In the second half, Smokin Joe picks up the pace. Bonavena just tries to hold off the attack, and he succeeds. Oscar was the first boxer who went the distance and lost by split decision. Joe's next opponent was Eddie Machen. He had a new man on his team. Coach Eddie Futch became an assistant to Yancey Durham. With such a terrific team, Frazier joined the championship race. Machen's fate was the same as everyone else's.
Back to the camera, sends in a short left hook, and Machen goes through the ropes. The referee steps in and stops the fight, awarding a KO to Smokin Joe Frazier, who continues his upward climb to the heavyweight championship of the world.
In September 1967, Joe was preparing to pass his last test. His opponent was George Chuvalo, one of the toughest heavyweights of those days, a brave boxer who wasn't afraid to lose. At the time, he had 13 losses. But not a single fighter had ever knocked him down, not even Muhammad Ali. George should be boxed, but fighting him was the worst thing you could think of, and Frazier came right at him. The gamble was paid off. Chuvalo was soundly beaten after the second round. On that day, the bob and weave defense was shown by Frazier in all its beauty. Joe dominated, and in the fourth round the fight was over. For the first time in his career, Chuvalo lost early, although he stayed on his feet.
The referee steps in and stops the fight.
In 1967, Frazier and the division underwent significant changes. The most prominent boxer of all time, Muhammad Ali became an exile due to his refusal to fight in the Vietnam War. As a consequence, he was stripped of his license, titles, and awards. Boxing is the sport most similar to gladiatorial combat. It also receives people's fickle love. After forgetting their hero, the public looks for a new object of adoration. With the vacancy open, many top boxers applied, and Frazier was among the favorites. Defeating Chuvalo and other challengers earned him a shot at the title, where he met his longtime foe, Buster Mathis. In the 11th round of their fight, Frazier won an epic rematch. The huge Mathis, who was 98 pounds heavier, fell to the canvas. As the fans celebrated the champion, Joe came to the reality that his childhood dream had come true. He's a champion. The same guy who wanted to be the new Joe Louis is now the hero of millions of kids. Smokin Joe made 4 title defenses in 2 years. Among the victims were old acquaintance Oscar Bonavena and former challenger Jerry Quarry.
Frazier is pummeling Quarry with left and right. Quarry striking back and getting it in with left and right. This is a slugfest.
But the struggle was just beginning. The heavyweight division was divided. While Frazier was reigning on one side, the WBA tournament was taking place on the other side to determine another champion. Eddie Futch suggested that Joe should refuse to participate in the tournament and challenge the winner instead. Joe followed his advice. In February 1970, Frazier, who held the WBC belt, and Jimmy Ellis, who held the WBA belt, met in a fight for the undisputed title. Ellis is a former middleweight who retains his speed and mobility. But no matter how fast Jimmy was, that day he was facing a fighter who seemed like the devil couldn't stop him. It was an all-out beating lasting 4 rounds. Frazier became the undisputed champion of the Royal Division. Along with titles, Joe gained fans. He didn't need any scandals to draw attention to himself. In the ring, his ruthless style spoke for itself. In daily life, he was a stylish person who was famous for his elegant look. Joe had a great love for headwear. He dressed differently than most of his contemporaries. Besides sport, he was fond of music and toured the USA and Europe with his band. Joe's favorite was legendary Frank Sinatra, whose hits he sang.
With the soul.
Since Joe Frazier became the official leader of the heavyweight, the boxing community has been divided. Some recognize the new king, while others refuse to accept reality. In their view, the rightful champion was Muhammad Ali, who had been brazenly robbed of his titles. After all, Ali didn't lose in the ring. He was a victim to a ruthless political system. Joe Frazier must decide: stay champion without a bout against the greatest opponent of his era and get no respect, or use his championship privileges to get what he wanted. Like a man of honor, Joe makes the right decision. While Muhammad Ali was out of boxing, Frazier supported him. He organized events to keep Ali in the public eye. Among other things, he financially supported him. After becoming champion, Joe met with President Richard Nixon and asked him to return Ali's license. Muhammad's gratitude was peculiar.
He has no rhythm, no footwork, no class. He cannot talk. And who told him he could sing?
Muhammad's comeback took time. He couldn't fight Frazier right away. Ali had 2 warm-up fights against Bonavena and Corey. Frazier, meanwhile, made a title defense, brutally knocking out Bob Foster.
Joe Frazier comes bombing right back. And Foster is hit with a paralyzing left hook. Champion Joe Frazier moves in to finish it. Paralyzing punches by champion Joe Frazier. A dynamite left hook and Bob Foster goes down again.
After beating Bonavena right in the ring, Ali received a phone call from Frazier. The promotion of the fiercest rivalry in history began. From that moment on, the boxers' budding relationship came to an end.
Took him to New York one time, gave him some love, and he got out the car. Joe Frazier! Joe Frazier got my title! Joe Frazier got my title! I want to whoop Joe Frazier. I said, no, you ain't gonna whoop you want to fight me, okay?
Fight of the Century had an incredible promotion. The boxers appeared on TV shows and even called each other. One day, Ali came to Philadelphia to visit Frazier. He drew a crowd outside Frazier's gym, which led to the iconic photo of the boxers standing in front of the glass door. Ali insulted Frazier, using derogatory terms like Uncle Tom and Gorilla, and ridiculing his appearance and abilities. But Frazier's rare answers were really worthy of respect.
Supposed to be from the same ancestor, unless he had some kind of different kind of thing going on in his family. And if I'm a gorilla, he got to be from the same ancestor. He must be a gorilla too.
With or without the insults, the battle was fated to succeed. But the enmity that Muhammad stirred up made the fight more than a rivalry. Ali's actions led to aggression towards Frazier and his family, including bullying his kids at school and death threats. While preparing for the defensive fight, Joe faced enormous pressure. The situation became so dire that police were forced to provide security outside his family's home. According to the children, they couldn't even leave the house because of the dangerous circumstances. It is amazing how an ordinary match could turn into a war, with the approach of which real hostilities ceased. The riots that were taking place in the USA, the revolutionary moods in Ireland, and military conflicts everywhere in the world stopped for a while. On March 8, 1971, there was only one question on everyone's mind. Who would be the winner?
I want him to build him up real big, make him just a terror and a giant. And right after the fight, I'm going to break my neck, get into the newspaper stand to see what the excuse is the next morning. I'm just waiting to see what the excuse is going to be when I whoop Joe Frazier.
Good exchange. A whipping right hand that did Muhammad Ali no good on the round.
Well, number one, he's too ugly to be the world heavyweight champion. His nose is flat, he's ugly, he can't talk, he's crazy, something like this.
On the jabs.
I have picked up the round that Joe Frazier will go down. I'm going to get on my knees and crawl across the ring, look up at him and say, you are the greatest, you are the president of the whole.
Joe wasn't a boxer. He was a punisher. On that day, he made his rival pay the price for everything he said. New York crowds who initially supported Ali chanted "Frazier, Frazier." But what happened in the final round increased respect for this boxer 100-fold. It was not the first knockdown Ali had been in, but it was the only time he had no answer.
Muhammad Ali gamely fights back.
Smokin Joe celebrated a convincing victory in the most important confrontation of his life, but he didn't get the promised apology. Triumph is always followed by a feeling of desolation, the so-called goal attainment syndrome. This is a normal process, which is explained by scientists as mental fatigue. Each person spends a lot of physical and, most importantly, psychological energy to succeed. As a result, he loses the taste of life, and sometimes even the meaning. Something similar happened to Joe Frazier. He was on top of the world, defeated everyone, and no longer felt the same hunger. A year later, Joe came back to the ring to defend his titles. He beat Terry Daniels and then Ron Stander. The boxer found a new motivation. It was the recognition he deserved but never got. We're talking about the recognition of a competitor. And at this moment on the skyline came a danger in person of the huge and horrible George Foreman.
Well, I'm not going to say too much about George because you all know that I'm not really a great rapper, mouth run offer. You know, it is like some people we know.
Yancey Durham opposed the matchup. The trainer understood that Foreman's style was a stylistic nightmare for his pupil. But the decision, which Joe would greatly regret, had already been made. George Foreman is an absolute force. So when you fight him from a position of power, you've already failed. But Joe Frazier simply didn't know how to fight otherwise. His courage has led him to many heights and has become his trademark. But in this case, it was leading him to failure. Frazier's first fall brings forth Howard Cosell's famous catchphrase, which will be used far beyond the sport.
Ali's trainer right next to me is saying it. You may hear him. Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier!
Frazier was down 5 more times in a round and a half, and was brutally toppled.
Of Joe Frazier! Down again! No saving by the bell!
Joe lost his titles, his reputation, his perspective. Everything he'd been going for years was lost in 4.5 minutes. He needed a new start. For a semi-blind, badly worn heavyweight, that's a terrible situation. But Joe Frazier never gave up. So the former champion went to England to fight the bigger Joe Bugner. The American won a natural victory, but once again left too much health in the ring. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali wanted to settle old scores. It meant the paths of the arch-rivals would cross again. In August of 1973, Frazier lost a friend, a mentor, and the man who made him a boxer. Yancey Durham died in his 54th year. This happened when Joe was preparing for a rematch with Ali. Eddie Futch took over as head trainer. The promotion of the fight went its way, but Muhammad's humiliation came more and more cruel. And if earlier Joe reacted to everything with a smile, Now it was increasingly difficult for him to restrain his emotions. The day before the fight, the boxers met on another TV show. The program hosts seated the rivals next to each other. All visible and invisible boundaries were shattered.
Why'd you bring up the hospital? I went to the hospital.
And Joe stood up, ripped off his microphone, and said, "What do you mean I'm ignorant?"
Sit down, Joe.
Why you think I'm ignorant?
Sit down, Joe.
Huh?
Sit down quick.
Why you think I'm ignorant?
The brothers are here.
Doing this too?
No. Sit down quick, Joe.
Sometimes a fight between two top-class boxers doesn't work out. That's what happened. In a rematch, Joe was too linear, and Muhammad tried to avoid trouble in every possible way. He moved a lot, clinched. Expectations were not justified at all. In a close fight, Muhammad Ali won by decision. For a warrior like Frazier, it was worse than losing to Foreman. He didn't feel like a loser, though he wasn't a winner either. The reputation of a brutal warrior was restored in the following performances. Frazier beating Jerry Quarry in a rematch. The third man in the ring that day was legendary Joe Louis.
Quarry has landed some hard head punches.
Smokin Joe scored his last career victory over Jimmy Ellis, another former opponent. The event took place in Australia. Joe won by technical knockout in the 9th round. This was a step towards a third and decisive fight with Muhammad Ali. In October 1974, Ali returned to the top with a sensational knockout of George Foreman. His third fight with Joe Frazier seemed to be a formality. Both were no longer in top form, but it was Frazier who was considered to be washed-up material. Joe's health was really bad. High blood pressure, arthritis, cataracts. The doctor was giving him painkillers because his body was falling apart. His back, his elbows, his shoulder, his knees, everything was wearing down. But it wasn't just boxing. From an early age, his body had been subjected to physical strain. On this occasion, Larry Merchant said, "Every legendary fighter saves his resources for the last great fight." And Frazier saved them. To avoid taxes, Don King organized a match in the Philippines, which was called Thrilla in Manila. The country was in a state of civil war at the time, but when the boxers arrived in Manila, the military conflict stopped for a month and a half. The last fight was the peak of Muhammad's rants. He was not particularly shy about his remarks and showed that he considered himself a man of the highest class. Ali was trying to create anger in Frazier's soul and deprive him of his composure.
It's not going to be a first round knockout. If it gets to that point, I want to go over and help him up. You understand? I want to take him to the distance. I want to take him to the bridge. I figure like when you knock a man out, you take him out of his misery. Suffer him a little bit, beating on him, that hurts him more than anything in the world.
The bout took place at 10 a.m. local time, in unbearably hot and humid conditions. Temperature levels in the arena reached as high as 49 degrees Celsius. The Philippine Coliseum was the epitome of a gladiatorial arena. Starting in the third round, Frazier took over the initiative. While Ali was using rope-a-dope tactics, Joe was setting a high rhythm.
aggressiveness in the Philippines.
From the 10th round, the fight of character began. Fatigue was becoming unbearable. The pain stiffened the body, but the boxers continued to strike blow after blow. Frazier's face was covered with bruises. There was no ice in his corner. It had turned into useless water. Going to the last break, the boxers did not suspect that they were separated from the desired victory by one decision. The last round remained. All they had to do was come out of their corner. Eddie Futch decides to stop the fight. The fighter was fighting blind. But if he had known the same decision was being made in the opposite corner. Seconds later, Muhammad Ali faints as he tries to celebrate his victory.
I'm up in the ring here.
Joe Frazier was defeated in one of the most brutal rivalries in history. It would be disrespectful not to voice the following fact. Joe Frazier didn't give up. He wasn't allowed to continue. And he lost. Muhammad Ali ordered his assistants to take off the gloves. He couldn't fight anymore, and he won. That's perhaps the reason we like boxing so much. The sport is unpredictable, dramatic, violent, and sometimes unfair. The final chord in Frazier's career was a rematch with George Foreman. This fight made no sense to Joe, but he took it anyway. Although the fight turned out to be more competitive than the first one, he still suffered an early defeat. Foreman was a real kryptonite for Frazier. Well, when he asked years later why he fought Foreman again, Joe said, "Because I'm a fighter. I gotta fight."
And Foreman's really going for it now. Oh, Joe Frazier collapses in the corner. Down for the second time in the 5th round.
After that defeat, Joe hung up his gloves. But 5 years later, he made a timid comeback attempt. It was a draw in a fight with Floyd Cummings. And this time, he said goodbye to boxing for good. Being retired, Joe took up coaching, managing the careers of his son Marvis and daughter Jackie. He led his daughter to a championship. In 2004, Joe cut the Olympic medal into 11 pieces and gave them to his kids. He said, "They will be put back together again when they bury me." In September 2011, the champion was diagnosed with cancer. 2 months later, he passed away. He was 67 years old. Floyd Mayweather covered all the expenses for his funeral. In 1976, the film Rocky debuted, and it quickly became a cult sensation, spawning multiple sequels. The character of Rocky Balboa was created primarily by Sylvester Stallone himself, although he drew inspiration from the stories of real boxers, with Joe Frazier being the most prominent among them. Sometimes movies seem too flashy and too unnatural. Life is much more dramatic. If you need an example, look at Joe Frazier. This is an ideal of a real man who fought for his dreams and always stayed a noble human being. Frazier has many catchphrases. He once said, "If you cheat the dark in the morning, you'll get found in the bright lights of the night." Remember that.